Hello and welcome to this module of major initiatives and interventions towards women's empowerment, trends and emerging issues on migrant refugees and women, where we talk of refugee women and those displaced for development. What I will attempt to do here is discuss the implications and complications of refugees and internally displaced people. Over the next 30 minutes, my attempt will be to draw your attention to the importance of a gendered understanding of problems faced by refugees and internally displaced people. As you are aware that human movement across the earth is not a new phenomenon. Our school books have been full of stories of travelers and adventurers. However, today human movement is a matter of grave concern. All movement has been categorized and subcategorized into administrative departments, and the news we read is about how the governments are dealing with a particular group of people. At the outset, one needs to understand that the problem arose with the identification and enforcement of the concept of nation states, a concept that took roots by the end of the First World War and has crystallized into a seemingly infallible, unchangeable reality carved in stone today. The turning point for human movement in modern history came with the First World War and its system of passports. To add to the problems of the unproven linkage between migration and terrorism, 9/11 came and now it has made it acutely difficult for human movements across the globe. As you all know, there are two types of human movements. First, by migrants who move from their lands of birth to other parts of the world for a better living condition. Raised in their homelands, migrants move in search of better resources and securing a better future for their future generations. They move within the same country or across countries depending on where they think they would find greener pastures. You would have seen migrants in your own vicinity, either someone from your own family who's moved abroad or someone you know who has moved abroad or another city or another country for a better job. Closer home, there is a strong possibility that you have come across migrants who may have worked as domestic helps in your homes or as carpenters or as some other kind of service providers. This module, however, focuses on the second category of migrants, that is involuntary migrants, people forced to shift out of their homes. The reasons for their displacements could be natural or man-made, but the shifting out of homelands is inevitable. If you pick up the newspaper today or just check the internet for news in your leisure time, you will keep coming across lakhs of people displaced due to floods or drought or some other natural calamity. We are not even in the second week of August today when the international news is talking about over 1 million people being evacuated in China due to the typhoons. People are displaced from their homes and forced to move to safer areas are involuntary migrants that we are dealing with today. And within the involuntary migrants, there are again two subdivisions that we will be dealing with here. The first is of refugees who are international migrants, and the second is of internally displaced people. Unlike migrants, refugees too move across lands and water, but for getting shelter. Refugees are people who are escaping hostile living conditions. Like I pointed out earlier, conditions could be of natural calamities like floods or drought or typhoons or any other natural disaster. Or the hostile condition could be man-made like war, ethnic violence, drawing up of international borders amongst others. Any such move forces people to move across countries and to seek safety and survival. At all times, one needs to remember that their primary target is not acquiring citizenship of countries that are giving them shelter or settling down in lands permanently that are providing them with the first safe shelter. They are essentially transiting to places till they are able to return to their original lands. The issue of refugees first came up to the fore during the First World War, when movements of people seeking refuge from war became visibly large. This was also the time when the processes of issuing papers to refugees came to be established. Please be clear, this is not the first time that humans were migrating to escape hostile conditions at home. History is replete with stories of such migrations, the most famous being of Jews moving to different parts of the world a few hundred years before Christ. Also, the system of issuing identity certificates to such refugees is also not a 20th century phenomenon. The Chinese, Africans, Indians all issued papers and received people with such papers throughout history. The significance of the First World War lies in the fact that it was for the first time that the entire world was sucked into the war. And the system of issuing and validating refugees on such a large scale came to be established. With every subsequent war and movement of refugees, the issue of asylum, work permits, and the legality of their movements came to the fore. Refugees are a crisis category people. Their vulnerability on a transnational level stems from their lack of papers or documentation that would allow them access to local economic platforms where they seek refuge. Their inability to legally work and earn a sustenance living in the land of refuge has been a major cause for humanitarian crisis afflicting the refugees. Refugees normally face a dual crisis. The first is the hostile conditions in the homeland that forces them to flee, and the second is the socio-economic discrimination they face in the lands they seek shelter in. With the growing population seeking trans-border refuge over time, the world has come to recognize the need to integrate migration issues into mainstream global development policies. Here we would like to draw your attention to the Tibetan refugees in India. They've been living in India for over 60 years, since they first fled the Chinese repression and occupation of their lands. However, till date, the fluidity of their status is disempowering. Till 2011, when Delhi High Court said authorities must abide by an earlier ruling that all Tibetans born in India between January 1950 and July 1987 are Indian citizens by birth and can be issued passports, they were carrying temporary papers and facing problems traveling out of the country or even moving within the country. Please remember, India is not a signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention, which spells out refugee rights and state responsibilities to protect them. Nor does it have a domestic law to protect more than 2 lakh refugees it currently hosts, including Tibetans, Sri Lankans, Afghans, Bangladeshis, and most recently, the Rohingyas from Myanmar. They are all considered foreigners by law. Tibetan refugees get enough rights and benefits according to the government, and even though everyone wants citizenship, it may not be possible. The question that arises is, will they always have to remain refugees, or should they be given some sort of permanent resident status, as they have been here for so long and have little chances of getting repatriated? Again, please remember, they've been here for 2 generations and more. The Tibetan Rehabilitation Policy of 2014 promises more rights and benefits. It proposes for the first time to give refugees welfare benefits on par with Indians, subsidies for some college courses, more job options, and greater ease in getting documents. However, it does not address property ownership, getting government jobs, or traveling freely within and outside the country. The Tibetan refugees are an excellent example of the problems faced by categorizing people as refugees. If they take up citizenship here, they lose their rights in their homelands. If they don't, they're in a constant state of political and economic insecurity of being foreigners. They can get shelter, but they are not entitled to any access to any of the social welfare schemes run by the governments like healthcare. As pointed out in the module, A lack of social welfare cover renders women and children to be most vulnerable. They have to bear the brunt of being devoid of proper sustenance, health care, education, and violence, both from within their communities and from outside. The fact that they are practically invisible makes their plight worse. They do not have voting rights, nor can they speak for themselves or seek redressal for their problems. Worse, when it comes to granting work permits or economic safeguards, governments always look to men as the heads of households. This brings us to the second category of involuntary refugees, namely those who are internally displaced. The internally displaced people, or IDPs, again are of two categories, namely those displaced due to natural calamities or those displaced due to man-made crises. Man-made crises are also of two kinds. The first is violence, like ethnic cleansing, clashes, riots, etc. And the second is the coercive displacement caused by development. The government displaces people for projects of urbanization, of trying to build up cities, providing better civic amenities to people. For some, it refers to people uprooted by conflict, violence, and persecution. That is, people who would be considered refugees if they crossed borders. However, others would consider internally displaced people to be a much broader concept and to encompass millions more people uprooted by natural disasters and development projects. Again, in this module, we are going to be focusing on the second category of IDPs, or those who are displaced for development. Numerically or statistically speaking, they form the larger chunk of the population other than refugees, and they are practically invisible. Since it is governments that displace them, it is the government's neglect that makes it difficult to make them visible. It is a staggering number of people who cannot access resources in the land of their own birth and have to move around it. Their lack of papers take away their political rights of voting and getting elected, and consequentially of being able to lessen their own woes. Displacement brings about vast multidimensional changes in the lives of those affected. These also include changes in the gender role equations of the displaced society. Their rights, and most importantly, accessibility to services and benefits in the new surroundings, are impossible. The launch of the Three Gorges Dam in China and the Sardar Sarovar Dam in India added a new dimension to the entire debate of internally displaced people. Involuntary resettlement associated with economic development. It is a phenomenon that is seen in all continents. The reason for displacements can vary from environmental factors to urbanization schemes to transport to remodeling cities, setting up networks for providing electricity, water, or other amenities, or measures that governments think are appropriate for the well-being of the country. It is estimated that development projects of various hues are responsible for over 60% of DIDs, or development-induced displacements. DIDs is primarily a socio-economic issue associated with the loss or significant reduction of access to basic resources on which communities depend. Deterioration of the people as a consequence of the implementation of development projects often has multi-generational and even irreversible effects. It is noted that affected communities generally do not participate in the decision to carry out a development project or are not considered even stakeholders in the development. neither do they receive a share in the profits from its operation. The key factor is the strong global differentiation between cases of DIDRs and the difference in the standards of resettlements. It is noted that affected communities generally do not participate in the decisions to carry out a development project, are not stakeholders in the development, and neither do they receive a share in the profits from its operations. The key factor in the strong global differentiation among cases of DIDRs is the difference in standards of resettlement, which determine the subsequent economic and social situation of the people. Over 15 million people each year are forced to leave their homes following big development projects, dams, irrigation projects, highways, urbanization, mining, national parks, etc. During the 1980s and 90s, the attention of the IDPs was brought to the notice of organizations like the World Bank or funding agencies that were directly investing in these projects. It took a lot of effort on the part of social activists, researchers at the World Bank, and academics to include the plight of the IDPs in the UN agendas. Resettlement due to implementation of development projects often leads to a decrease in the levels of almost all important categories of human security emphasized in the UN DP of 1994. Economic security, food security, health security, environmental security, personal security, community security, and political security. All securities. The crisis of the displaced was the major reason the United Nations was compelled to ask governments to include them in the developmental goals. Launched in 2000, Millennium Development Goals had set tangible targets to cut extreme poverty, reduce child mortality, and promote universal primary education. The MDGs, however, neglected to take into account the needs of the IDPs. In 2015, the UN General Assembly provided the backdrop for the adoption of Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs. The purpose of the SDGs is to help guide the world in its quest to achieve sustainable development by 2030 in 3 dimensions: economic, social, and environmental. This has included both refugees and IDPs as stakeholders, and part of those whose development was included are the IDPs. The price for human development, the SDGs estimated, was close to being $3 trillion. This brings us back to the issue why we should be looking at a gender-specific agenda when it comes to refugees and internally displaced people. As it is, access of women to natural and economic resources is minimal. Just 1% of the world's women own land. They face gender-based discrimination and violence in their everyday lives. Ordinary everyday tasks like collecting water or going to the toilet can put them at risk of rape and abuse. In times of displacement, their problems escalate manyfold. Women and girls make up around 50% of any refugee or internally displaced people or stateless populations, and those who are unaccompanied, pregnant, heads of household with disabled or with elderly are especially vulnerable. When they are displaced from their homes, women and girls are more vulnerable to violence and abuse, particularly if they are not accompanied by male relatives. The risk of human trafficking also increases. When displacement results in female-headed households, women may struggle with additional burdens of fulfilling both male and female roles within the family. Female migrants, especially in cases of forced migration or displacement, may be forced to move into prostitution or sex work to survive or provide for their families. Displacement can disrupt social and gender norms and can bring added pressure for men and women alike, as well as increasing the vulnerabilities faced by women and girls. Male refugees in temporary camps may no longer be able to provide their families as being the basic breadwinners. Domestic violence by a spouse or family member can increase as families experience psychological trauma and psychosocial trauma. Male refugees in temporary camps may no longer be able to provide their families as breadwinners. Domestic violence by a spouse or family member can increase the family's experience of trauma, psychosocial trauma, as well as psychological trauma. And as male refugees struggle with feelings of inadequacy and loss of control within the family, the traumas increase. Women and girls in refugee camps typically continue to be responsible for fetching the family's firewood and water, often going beyond the camp walls where they are faced with increasing sexual and gender-based violence. Even within the camps, women and girls are exposed to increased risks of violence from other refugees. As you'd see in the case of Syria or in the case of Rohingya refugees, for example, displaced families may choose early or forced marriage for their daughters as a strategy to cope with economic hardships or perceived risks of sexual violence. During times of crisis, states may be less able to protect and provide adequate services, further disadvantaging vulnerable refugees, including women and girls. The Fourth World Conference on Women, held in Beijing in 1995, led to the Platform for Action, covering 12 critical areas of concern, including the human rights of women, violence against women and girls, and violence against women in conflict. Since then, some progress has been made, particularly with the adoption of the guiding principles on internal displacement in 1998. In 1999, UNICEF and the Women's Commission for Refugee Women and Children organized an expert meeting on the gender dimensions of internal displacement. Two major areas were brought into focus. One, the need for safeguarding and protecting women and girls from rape, sexual exploitation, forced sexual slavery, torture, and murder. And second, the recognition of their rights for full participation in the management of the camps. In June 2014, civil society organizations and networks signed the Stockholm Agenda on Migrant and Migration-related Goals and targets to be included in the post-2015 development framework. The agenda starts from a position that SDGs must address root causes and conditions that force people to migrate, especially surging global inequalities driven by current development and economic paradigms. Classification of development-induced displaced persons or DIDPs, refugees and internally displaced persons rest on fundamental differences in the type of assistance provided to each category. While people displaced as a result of development have similar experiences to those of refugees, particularly as defined by the UNHCR, in terms of economic and social loss, they are not protected by the international laws. Children are particularly affected as displacement not only disrupts their education and normal development, but also frequently results in their being separated from their families in the chaos of flight and are left to fend for themselves and at a heightened risk of abuse. Compounding their plight, the displaced are often stigmatized and may also be viewed with suspicion and hostilities in areas to which they flee. Women and children typically make up the majority of the internally displaced populations, and they face a range of particular risks: heightened levels of sexual and gender-based violence, in particular among single unaccompanied women and girls, as well as women heads of households, have been documented, though they remain poorly addressed. Trafficking is another serious risk that increases when people are displaced. Families are separated, livelihoods are destroyed. Displaced women and children who suddenly find themselves widowed or orphaned may not have the documentation in their own names. A lack of documentation can lead to denial of access to healthcare, education, and other government services, as well as problems in resolving issues of property, restitution, or compensation. Moreover, because voting rights are almost invariably tied to laws of general application to the electoral's place of residence, a lack of documentation commonly results in disenfranchisement of the internally displaced, depriving them of a say in the political, economic, and social decisions that affect their lives. Displacement is a socio-economic, political, and a large global problem that needs to be addressed at local and global platforms. Both refugees and displaced for development are involuntary migrants. The largest obstacle in their right to live as citizens of the world comes from the very governments that exist to safeguard their well-being. Transnational refugees may or may not have the adequate papers to seek a decent living in new lands. Development-induced displaced, on the other hand, are disenfranchised and rendered resources in the lands of their own origins. Both processes are dehumanizing and need a gendered understanding to reach a solution. It is possible that you have either witnessed groups of involuntary migrants in your vicinity, or you've witnessed refugees in your neighborhoods. Through this module, we wanted to sensitize you to their problems and draw your attention to the cause that feminists are taking up in this regard. The gender vulnerability in all crises gets heightened. As South Asians, we've been witnessing refugees both within and without our countries. Drought, floods, landslides, and man-made calamities have delivered them in our midst. A gendered understanding of their crisis is critical to restoring their human rights and dignity to them. With this, we come to the end of this session. We hope that it was an informative session. Thank you for your patience.